Last week we did a webinar with the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Philip Lowe. This was as to be a speech at a lunch of the Economic Society in front of 241 people, but unfortunately because of COVID, this became a national webinar. I introduced the Governor, and then he spoke on employment, and then I asked him questions, and then there was various questions from what was a very, very large national audience to the webinar. He started by saying that when he spoke to us 2 years ago, that he had argued that to get full employment in Australia, you needed to have unemployment below 5%. On this occasion, he reduced that target down towards 4%. He showed that unemployment had already fallen very, very rapidly in the recovery from the shutdown in 2020, resulting from the pandemic, when unemployment was well over 7%, and there was now just over 5%. But he said the problem was that wages growth was very low, and it was just above 1%. And what he really wanted to do was, he thought that in order to achieve his inflation target of between 2 and 3%, say around about 2%, that he needed to have wages growth in Australia of 3%. And the reason for that is, as it's commonly observed, that 85% some people of the 85% of the Australian workforce are actually in the services sector. So it's services wages which drive inflation, and he thought that even though there might be a little bit of blip in inflation in the middle of this year, in fact he thought that inflation might get up to 3%. It wasn't sustainable at that level because wages growth was much lower. And what he showed in graph number 2 was the history of wages growth in Australia this century. And he noted that currently wages growth is only about 1.5% a year, and that's way below where it needs to be to generate 2% inflation. As he said, he needed to have wages growth at 3%. And he noted when we look back at the history of wages growth this century that we haven't in fact had wages growth at 3% or better since the first decade of this century. It's a long time since we've had wages growth high enough to generate his target of inflation. He noted that on page 5 of the presentation that the participation rate has recovered dramatically in the Australian workforce to slightly above the level that it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Now that's quite a better situation than is the case in the US, where it's now about 2% lower than it was in the beginning of the pandemic. But it means that people are wanting to return to work. And he then looked at the areas of the low unemployment and higher unemployment, and he shows this on graph number 9, where it's areas like accommodation and food, say tourism and retail is where there's higher unemployment, but very, very low unemployment in things like the wholesale sector, and other business services, and particularly low unemployment in mining. So turning again to this issue of wages growth, and remember that he said that in order to achieve his target of 2% inflation, he needed to achieve 3% wages growth. He then looked again at this issue of wages growth, but this time included bonuses and commissions. But pretty much it's the same kind of result that we've shown before, and that is that we hadn't had wages growth in this 3% area, even with bonuses and commissions, with or without them, since the first 10 years of this century. So how do we go about this? And then what he showed was a cross-sectional analysis. Now, cross-sectional analysis is where you look at a lot of different industries and how low unemployment has to be in those industries to generate enough wages growth to hit his targets. And he showed, and this is the most important chart in the whole of the presentation, and this is chart 12, and it's called Employee Income Growth and Unemployment, and it's based on 289 local markets. This is research by the RBA, 289 local markets over the period from 1998 to 2018. So it's a period of almost 20 years from the very end of last century until the most recent available data. And what it shows is that unemployment needs to be very low indeed. On this chart, what we see is we don't really get enough even the beginning of wages growth, which is higher than inflation, that is to say upward pressure on inflation, until we get unemployment at 5% or lower. And indeed, if you look more closely at this chart, in order to get wages growth 1% higher than inflation, which is what he says his objective is, you need to get unemployment down at 2%. Now, what's really important about these types of levels of unemployment, particularly going down to 2%, is we haven't seen those lower levels of unemployment since the 1960s. And this suggests that something might be about to happen in Australia, which in the last few years has been happening in the US. In the US in 2019, unemployment fell down to 3.5%, a level which had not been seen in the United States since 1968. Jay Powell, in a piece we wrote and actually published last week, said that he thought in this cycle unemployment would again fall to that level of 3.5%. Of course, at that low level of unemployment, what happened in 2019 and what will happen again in a couple of years' time, perhaps 2024 when we get down to that level of unemployment in the US, is there will be wages growth in the US economy. Jay Powell is trying to achieve that, obviously in his case to sustain inflation at target. Now, the point of this is that if the Federal Reserve is going to have to take unemployment down to 1960 levels, it looks to me on the basis of Philip Lowe's speech and chart 12 is that the Reserve Bank of Australia is also going to take unemployment down to 1962 levels, because in 1968, when unemployment in the US was 3.5%, unemployment in Australia was 2%. So Philip Lowe has the objective of achieving 3% wages growth and 2% inflation. And he believes he needs to do that to sustain inflation at his target level. In order to do that, based on chart 12 in his presentation, he needs to take unemployment in Australia below 4% and perhaps as far as 2%, a level of unemployment which hasn't been in the 1960s, seen in Australia since the 1960s. So it would appear that the RBA, like the Federal Reserve, is trying to generate wages growth similar to the 1960s by taking unemployment down to levels not seen since the 1960s. And that shows that we are entering a new economic age, both driven by the Federal Reserve and the RBA, of very low levels of unemployment and relatively high real wages growth, which, if both of those organisations believe, is the new equilibrium in coming years.